Hey there, this is Dan. You're watching the Salty Sea, and we have massive leaks coming out of France, still done by GW. They uploaded their new Cities of Sigmar everything to the French website. It took a little while for people to find it, but it's here. We have all new stats for everything that came out for Cities of Sigmar, and it's incredibly exciting because there's quite a few points changes coming in as well, which could mean a new sort of points philosophy for GW. It could mean a Tome of Champions on the way. It could mean just a pretty massive points changing FAQ, something like that. So keep your eyes peeled in the future. They've completely changed the structure of Cities of Sigmar, and in some places they refer to it as Cities of Sigmar, like here, and in some places they refer to it as Order of Azir. But there are no more city-specific abilities, which to me is good riddance. Now, I will miss Tempest's Eye. I really liked being able to accelerate my dwarves around. This does mean that my beloved Thundercat Daycare, which is a list that I still play on my own personally, is going away. But good riddance in general, just because having 6 different ability sets when only 2 of them were really being used at all just was such a waste. So now they're structuring it by all the humans are going to have one set of abilities, all the elves are going to have one set of abilities, and all the dwarves are going to have one set of abilities. You can still mix and match between a warband. A lot of the abilities are keyword locked to, humans, dwarves, elves, but you can do really clever things like you could have, say, 2 of your deployment groups be humans, keying off each other's human rune marked things, and then one of your deployment groups be all dwarves keying off each other's all dwarf rune marked things. And so you still have this mix and matched warband that can still work really well. And I'm really excited to see how people attack that with their Cities of Sigmar lists. I think it's going to be really cool. And we get new profiles. So almost no stats have changed. If any stats have changed, I missed it. But a lot of points have changed. Some really big notable buffs here. All the Elven rank and file is down 5 to 10 points, which is amazing. So Dread Spears and Bleak Swords are much better now for 55 points for that profile. I mean, that's a huge percentage buff. For 55 points, you don't really mind anymore that they only have 8 wounds. Plus, these guys always had that 4 toughness, so some things actually are really good at dealing 8 wounds to something in toughness 3, but don't necessarily do it to toughness 4. So I am excited to see Bleak Swords on the table. Personally, I think that they will be good now that they're at 55. Much in the way that ghouls are good, even though, they're 55 points, they're only 8 wounds, but they move 5. They're really good because now at 55 points, you don't care if you lose them. And I think those 10 points really matter for a unit that really only does anything once you've got 5 of them, right? Don't think of this as a 10-point nerf. Think of this as a 50-point nerf. And then I just showed this Executioner here to show that even the mid-range fighters are also all getting a pretty big points drop. Black Arc Corsairs are down to 60 points too. They are the same as a Bleak Sword, but with 1 additional attack, which is pretty exciting. And another thing that I noticed is that Dark Shards, which are the Dark Elf crossbowmen, they are only down 5 points, which I think is really good, really promising, because ranged buffs need to be done really carefully. Ranged units are sort of the type of unit most able to kind of break the game if they're really good. So we don't want to over buff them right away. And I'm excited to see if people do start playing with Dark Shards. I don't think 5 points will be enough, but I'm glad they didn't do anything crazy. More buffs come for the Elven Heroes, which is really cool. All of them are down 15 to 20 points, which I think potentially brings some of them into playability. I think the Assassin was close where it was, not quite there. And now for 165 points instead of 185, I think it's much more tempting to bring an Assassin into your games. And so that's really nice. Dwarven heroes were sort of reshuffled. Warden Kings and Rune Lords are down 5 points. Keeper of the Gate and Ironbeard are down 10. But the Old Guard, the Iron Warden, and the Cogsmith are all up 5 points. So a bit of a reshuffle there as they change how they like to, let's say, value the different things that different dwarves do. It's pretty clear that they've been watching the metagame, given that the Old Guard is up 5 points to be the same as now that the Rune Lord is down 5 points, because people were taking Old Guards all over the place. Now, people were taking Old Guards because of the ability Swift as the Wind from Tempest's Eye, and that is no longer here. So did the Old Guard need to go up? I don't know, but it is exciting to see things like Warden Kings coming down just a tiny bit, because those were solid but not really getting taken as often. A lot of big nerfs, and there are a few different ways we can kind of conceptualize these nerfs, and I'm open to speculation. So first, just to get into it, Ironbreakers went from 60 points to 75. All of the Dwarven chaff got really big nerfs. That Ironbreaker nerf is a 25% nerf. That's huge. Longbeards are up 10. Hammerers are up as well. The only thing that escapes the nerf bat is the Iron Drakes. I am a little bit worried, since they're a shooting unit, that, they are sort of signaling a general buff to ranged units, but I think they might not do it in too crazy a way. We'll see. I mean, Iron Drakes weren't getting taken, so this particular no change is not a worry at all. The one question for me is, are these dwarves being nerfed into the ground because GW is reevaluating Move 3 chaff? There are some reasons to think so. For example, the fact that the Dwarven heroes were only sort of reshuffled versus the Dwarven chaff going way up shows that they clearly understand something about, cheap fighters that are really sort of full of stats are more of a problem than these expensive Move 3 fighters. But there's a separate reading of this where you could say that they're really only going up in points because Duardin just got the strongest reaction in the game. It's called Bearers of Grudges, and if the translation is to be believed, a fighter can make this reaction when targeted by a melee attack action after having totaled the damage, but before allocating it, if it's sufficient to knock out the fighter, choose another friendly fighter. The friendly fighter takes a bonus move action or a bonus attack action. Now, that is the same as the Quester Soulsworn buff, but Quester Soulsworn are 160 points at minimum, and now you can get that reaction for 75 points, and you can have it in a warband that has lots of even cheaper chaff, right? We just saw 55-point chaff. We know that you can mix and match them. You can have tons of numbers in a Cities of Sigmar warband and include some dwarves that are kind of in your opponent's face, and then as soon as they get killed, they can react and give a free move to something else, right? Your opponent is going to need to take the dwarves off the battlefield because we'll see later, but they have a ability for a double that essentially says you must kill this dwarf or you lose the game. So the opponent is going to be heavily incentivized to take out your dwarves in the mid game, and so you'll be able to really get this reaction going like crazy, and that's really powerful. So I think it's really reasonable to think maybe they got nerfed because they're cheap Move 3 chaff that's been kind of dominating the game from time to time, or you could say that they're just getting an amazing reaction. I think it might be both. I think the Ironbreaker going up 15 is too much to just be explained away by a reaction, especially given that some of the reactions before, like for example, the Living City reaction, were really good. Maybe not this good, but really, really good. The Living City reaction is amazing on dwarves. So I think it's a combination. I think they're going up a little bit because GW is reevaluating how Move 3 chaff are going to work, and I think they're going up a little bit extra because their reaction is just off the wall bonkers. And it does mean that dwarves are still going to be playable, and I'll get into kind of more of the things they might be able to do later in the video. But first, we have to cover new units. All of the new releases that came with Cities of Sigmar, all the ones that are Warcry sized, are getting into the game, including the Fusilmager who rides an ogre. That is one of the most ridiculous models. It reminds me a little bit of when 40k gets like the Space Marine baby carrier, for example, where it's like got no armor around the Space Marine, but there's a big dreadnought all around it. Stuff like that can feel really silly, or the bikes where you shoot from essentially the top of one Space Marine's head, so you would just like concuss them every single time with the gun. Things like that. This has that same over-the-top ridiculous energy. I did not think it would get into Warcry. I thought it would be too big, and I'm so glad it is because the profile is really interesting. Strength 6, toughness 6. The damage is not really that crazy, but it is very consistent, especially which is what you want with a sort of only 3 attack profile. But 3, 6, 3, 4, meaning you're not really fishing for crits here. Every hit is pretty valuable, which is kind of fun. They had shown in a White Dwarf this exact sort of same fighter, and they'd even said this mission is meant to be done with the Fusilmager on top of Dwarf. And instead of a 2-4-2-4 with 24-inch range, they had a 1-4, like 4-10, one of those ridiculous swingy profiles that there were actually quite a few of in the old Cities of Sigmar, as far as like any kind of shooty gun with 10 damage on crits and then big damage on regular hits too, but only 1 attack. Those profiles are incredibly unfun because like we know what's good with them, right? You buff them, they're useless when they're not buffed, they're really good when they are buffed, but when you buff them, they get like a widely out of proportion benefit from the buffs that makes them really unfun and really swingy. And it makes it so that when they don't work, it's because your opponent just like ran you down, ended the game. There was nothing you could do. And when they do work, you just blow your opponent off the board, and your opponent feels like there was nothing they could do, and neither player feels like they played Warcry. Well, none of those profiles are still here. There were a bunch in the old Cities of Sigmar sort of lists, and not very many people were taking them, but they were there in the profiles. But now there are none, which is amazing. It's showing that Games Workshop, I think, understands how these things actually play in a much better way than they used to. I think, it is funny because just a month ago they released the Arbalester, which was the Wildercorpse Hunters big artillery guy who has an incredibly unfun, stupid profile that shouldn't be in the game. But it's clear that, that they had to kind of design and publish probably 6 months ago. They were packing those cards into boxes. And at this point, I think they've seen what players do with those types of profiles. They've seen what players do with Aether Cannons. They've seen what players do with Hrothgorn, things like that. On a more casual side, they've seen people kind of do silly things with Knight Judicators. And I think they're, at least reading the tea leaves here, it seems like they are pulling back on those kinds of stupid, unfun profiles. And that's a great sign for Warcry. I love it. Now, this profile that they've sort of replaced it with isn't very powerful. 2-4-2-4 on a 245-point fighter is a little bit disappointing, but 24-inch range is very serious, especially because the guy shooting is really high up. So you are going to be able to see over terrain, and you are going to be able to shoot the entire battlefield. If they had a big damage profile at 24-inch range on such a tall fighter, it would be just completely stupid and ridiculous. Whereas now, there is no one on the battlefield who can hide from you, but your output is not all that special for 245 points. So it becomes a really interesting sort of piece of, it's really just an anvil that shoots is really what's going on, which I think is really cool. There are also terrifying new chaff options for humans. I think all 3 of the cheap fighters I've put on the board here are really good. We've got whatever a burger de arms is, aims is, but 14 wounds for 70 points is a perfectly fine sort of ratio there as far as not getting killed. And the thing that I think is really cool is this 3/7 profile with 5 attacks. Now, they only do 1 damage, and they only hit on 5s and 6s against any fighter in the game. But 5 attacks is interesting. So you are often going to be, the modal outcome is going to be to do 2 damage at range, which is not a lot, but with a 70-point fighter, that's kind of hard to kill. Popping 2 damage onto things all over the place with your, 3 different burgers is going to be pretty decent, especially combined with lots of other chaff options, which you're going to get. You have the Chirurgeon, which is going to have 12 wounds for only 60 points at move 4. Your ability to kind of get to a place and not die is going to be pretty real. And then you have the Gargoyle, which is only 50 points for 10 wounds, and the 3-3-1-3 profile isn't blowing anyone away, but at 50 points, you can have so many of these. It's really easy to just say, hey, I'm going to start my list with 3 Gargoyles, because at only 150 points, it leaves tons of room for whatever else I want to do. And just having one in every deployment group to just run around the battlefield, spray some points, spray some damage around is going to be really powerful, incredibly powerful. I think all of this whole human release is 100% competitively viable. I mostly ignored the Cities of Sigmar release when it came out. But I would say now, this Order of Aesir, these sort of Castellans, I think, group is really got my attention. I think they're going to be very powerful. I think it's going to take some figuring out because, they don't have natural heavy hitters to go with the chaff. So the kind of smooth brain approach to list building isn't necessarily going to work. You're going to need to use their abilities. But luckily, they have some good ones. By the way, before I move on, Wanderers have officially been sunsetted from Warcry. If anyone's in my games and has Wanderers, please just proxy them for other elves and it'll all be fine. All the elf profiles are very similar to what Wanderer profiles were before, so proxy them for any elf faction you want. I think they go really well as Idoneth Deepkin, and of course they could do Cities of Sigmar as well. Their abilities are so interesting too. So with having leaked, all the profiles and everything, we also have the abilities, and there's a ton of new design space. First of all, Darkling Covens, I'm sorry, your abilities are terrible, but you got huge point nerfs, so I think you'll still be okay. All the Dispossessed are really interesting. So that reaction, of course, they have the best reaction in the game now, but they also have really interesting doubles, which I think represent really significant strides in design philosophy. So Sullen Barood, again, this is a translation. We don't know exactly what that will be, but being able to subtract 1 from the damage allocated by each hit and crit from attack actions that target anybody dispossessed who's within 3 inches of this fighter, and it's just a double. All the dispossessed have it. So all of them can be sullen and give all of their friends a big bonus, which means only one of them has to use it, and then everybody gets the bubble, is, I think, really strong and going to make them really difficult to kill, which combos amazingly with the double, which this is definitely not the correct translation, but it will be necessary to pass on the body. Whatever that's actually going to be when it gets to English. Until the end of the battle round, this fighter counts as 2 additional fighters to determine which player controls an objective. This is one of the only times we've gotten anything like this. Ironjaws has something a little bit like this for messing around with objectives, but being able to triple the count for one of your dwarves, again, one of your 75-point dwarves now counts as 3 fighters on an objective, is going to make having a few dwarves here and there, they are going to be absolute must-kill threats for your opponent. The fact that they are each counting, only 1 or 2 dwarves are going to be able to do this because it is on a double. But the fact that your opponent is going to have to really worry about the couple dwarves you have because they can single-handedly win the game, it's going to be something where if at the very beginning of a round you get to pop this double and wait, and then your opponent has to kill your dwarf before the end of the battle round. So you just sit there waiting with your single Ironbreaker who is counting for 3 fighters, who is oftentimes going to be single-handedly winning the game for you on his own. Your opponent now sees him as an absolute must-kill threat. He's T5, 12 wounds. It's going to be difficult to take him out. And when they do, he gets his reaction where he can make any of your fighters do a bonus attack or a bonus move, which is huge in terms of the amount of value you get if you're doing that bonus attack or bonus move on like a 250 point fighter who is just, like a big Kurnoth Huntmaster or something who just like crushes something because you killed the little dwarf. That kind of sort of spacing play as far as sort of making the objectives work for you is going to be the sort of thing that brings Dispossessed a lot of wins, even though they've had these massive points nerfs. Now, I normally, when I go to a tournament, I want to just be overwhelming my opponent on efficiency. So it's not necessarily the easiest warband to make work, but the tools are absolutely there to cobble together wins in a lot of different situations. And then they also have a strength buff that normally strength buffs are just much worse than attack buffs, but this one is on a double, which is sort of indicating that maybe GW starts to understand that these aura buffs are some of the more fun things you can do in Warcry, and we should make them playable. And this is a playable strength buff, which is so rare. So that's cool. And so I really like that. Humans also get the War Chanter double. So I do think this is an indication that GW is more friendly to aura buffs in general now. And that's just +1 attack on a 6-inch radius. And the nice thing, the only real innovation there is it's on a double, the same way the War Chanter in Ironjawz has it on a double. And most fighters, for example, in Chaos, the best one is the Chaos Lord having it on a triple, and Skaven have it on a triple. Having it on a double is twice as good as having it on a triple because you can get 2 doubles for the price of a triple. So I love seeing that. It's really good. Also, the Castellan formation, you add 2 strength, you add 2 toughness instead of just 1. Toughness buffs are really difficult to use because in half of your games, they just don't matter at all. And even when they do matter, it's only 1 dice that gets changed, and there's a decent chance that your opponent doesn't even roll that dice. And so a lot of the time, you spend wild dice on something that ends up having 0 impact on the game. Giving it +2 toughness increases the number of times it'll matter, like have the potential to change dice, and it increases the likelihood of a dice getting changed when it does have that effect. So I think that's a really good sign. I think these aura buffs are really fun, and making them actually matter is cool. I think that's a much better direction than where they had of just either massive burn spells or bonus actions, or just like the Brugit having a massive effect on one fighter. I think all of those are significantly less fun than these kinds of aura buffs that make you sort of think about your spacing and positioning a little bit. So there's a lot of really exciting stuff going on. I think that, both the dwarves and the humans have a lot of play, but I also think that mixed up factions are also going to be pretty good, just because the Elven Chaff models, I really want to see if those 55-point Chaff fighters are going to be playable. So there's a lot for people to get excited about, and who knows, right? Because the one thing that I think is worth speculating on is whether this means that we have a new points change incoming. They clearly have a different algorithm for how they're determining points for these fighters than they have for the general fighters in the rest of Warcry. So does that mean a Tome of Champions is coming? In which case, that would be awesome. It would probably be late winter, early spring, and it would, be enough to shake everything up before, next year's tournaments. Or does this mean an FAQ is coming? In which case it might happen right away, which would be sad if it ends the year of the dwarf before the calendar year is actually over. But But I think a lot of people are sick of move three chaff being really good. I think a lot of people are sick of like clearly mistake ranged profiles being really good. And, essentially, those are the three pillars of the metagame right now are move three chaff, mistake range profiles, and Brugit lists. Now, I think that the range three, or sorry, the ranged mistake profiles, I think, are less of a pillar than the other two, but they are people do win with them a lot, and between KO and Hrothgorn, it's pretty out there. So hopefully we see changes to those three. I would prefer it comes in a Tome of Champions sort of format because they put a lot of other cool stuff in the Tome of Champions, and it was really sad last year when we didn't get one. But if it comes in an FAQ, that's amazing too, and it could mean a lot for the game, and it would be a lot to digest, which would mean a lot of content for this channel. So until then, until we find out which that is, may all your rolls be crits.